We begin by considering man's complete nature. We shall study the principles of that nature, or man's essence in its component parts, to which the nature itself and all that belongs to it are adjusted. Man is made up of body and soul. More precisely and metaphysically, we may say, man is a being consisting of a potential and an actual principle, a material, determinable, and a formal, determining principle. But the formal element in this composition is not engulfed in the material element, as in purely material beings, or dependent on matter for its activity, as in plants, or bound to matter as the support and organ of its functions, as in animals. The form is so autonomous, since it is a form that not merely inheres in something else, but subsists in itself, that it can exercise a completely independent activity, which is even hampered by materiality. This activity is intellectual cognition. Yet this one principle in man represents all the functions which other formal principles in their various gradations represent in lower natures. Thus, an extremely rich and manifold life and the most varied kinds of activity unfold in man. All the degrees of the scale of being in the spiritual and material world are concentrated in him, but in such a way that by their encounter they are mutually modified in their activity and relations. Spirit and matter, high and low, are wonderfully united in man, and this gives rise to the difficulty of understanding man's nature in all its wealth of meaning. But in general we may say that all the perfection of this nature comes from the side of the spirit, i.e., of the informing, determining, higher principle, while all imperfection and weakness come from the side of the sensible, hence the material, determinable element. The perfection of the spirit is based on the fact that it does not include matter in its being, precisely because matter is a purely potential element. These two opposed elements enter into a certain unity in which they reciprocally affect and modify each other. The material body, which in itself is a mass without unity, life or movement, is held together in coherence, endowed with life, and moved by the spirit as the principle that unifies, animates, and moves. But by its union with matter, the spirit forfeits its purely spiritual independence to a certain extent, and even incurs a sort of slavery to matter. Matter prevents the spirit from beholding itself in its spiritual essence, and in general from enjoying the intuition of purely spiritual things. It forces the spirit to direct its spiritual activity to objects on hand, within the realm of matter, to things of sense, yet does not thereby upset the independence and spirituality of this activity. Thus the union of the two elements with each other does not turn to the advantage of the higher of them. It causes the higher element to become somewhat estranged from itself, in the sense that this element does not possess itself as perfectly as it would if it were alone. Furthermore, the resulting union is not perfect, as this would imply the complete subjection of the lower element to the higher. The essential opposition between matter and spirit gives rise to a certain cleavage and opposition in man, which cannot be overcome by the spirit's inherent power. This dissension does not only manifest itself in an occasional clash between the higher and the lower life in man. Since matter irresistibly proceeds in the direction of dissolution, the tension eventually becomes so taut that it rends man's whole nature asunder. The spirit is then thrown back on itself and goes on to develop its own life more freely, while matter loses its form and its life. This opposition between matter and spirit may give the impression that the spirit is thwarted, persecuted, and shackled by matter, and that freedom has to await the death of the body. It also keeps human nature from achieving perfect unity. From ancient times, therefore, this has been the reason why many thinkers regarded matter itself as evil, or the union of spirit with matter as unnatural and as punishment for some sin committed by the spirit. But the union is in fact natural. The spirit fashions matter into its own body and pervades it with its own life. Matter, which is not evil in itself, but only imperfect and potential, yields submissively to the spirit. However, since matter and spirit are so immensely different, a completely harmonious union cannot be wrought by the spirit's own power. The spirit cannot wholly conform matter to itself, any more than matter can wholly immerse the spirit in itself. Matter cannot draw the spirit down to its own level in such a way that the entire life and activity of the spirit is organic and bound to matter, as is the case with the formal principle in the purely animal and vegetable life of beasts and plants. On the other hand, the spirit cannot draw matter and corporality up to itself and rule them in such a way that their entire activity and aspirations join forces with the spirit's functions, and that the life which the spirit imparts to matter becomes as indestructible and imperishable as its own spiritual life. As long as the cleavage is not overcome, we have no unified and no perfect nature, and therefore some thought that they had to maintain that in the normal, natural state, the spirit must have power to produce such unity, that is, the power to subject sense life to the life of the spirit, to make it conformable to the spirit, and to hug the body to itself in indissoluble life. No doubt the ideal picture we paint of human nature includes this thoroughgoing spiritualization of matter, by which matter is fully subjected and conformed to the animating spirit. More than this, it even implies that the spirit, notwithstanding its enduring union with matter, retains complete control of itself, so that it is able to develop its own activity as spiritually and freely as though it were not united to matter at all. Yet who does not perceive how far beyond the natural power and ability of the spirit is the demand that it should be thus intimately united with matter and still not be tied down by matter? Who does not see that matter would then be not only animated by the spirit, but in a sense spiritualized, so that the spontaneous development of its own properties would be quite inhibited? Surely such a power is no more natural for the spirit than the present union, in which human nature is now situated, of the spirit with the body is unnatural. Accordingly, the spirit lacks the power to mend the cleavage and to concentrate the whole nature within itself in a higher unity. On the other hand, matter does not permit its own spontaneous development, such as it is, to be thwarted. Consequently, man's nature has neither the power nor the need to repair the dissension by producing such unity. Is the cleavage, then, to remain forever? And if so, where is the unity that is unconditionally necessary for the perfection of nature? But why, I ask in turn, must human nature remain forever? The contrary principles of which this nature is composed cannot be held together eternally by natural force. Nature harbors within itself the principle of its dissolution. This is a sign that it has no claim to permanent duration. If that is so, the dissension prevalent in nature does not have to be repaired in such a way that the lower part is conformed to the higher part by an elevation and transfiguration of its natural essence. Release can be procured by the progress of the lower part toward the death it carries within itself. It will be separated from the higher part, and the latter can develop its life freely and without restraint in untroubled unity, and thus more easily realize its own perfection. But does not the union of the spirit with the body turn out to be unnatural if it is only transitory, if it is not to endure forever but must come to an end just when the spirit is at the point of attaining its full perfection? No, it is not unnatural, because spirit and matter are united to form one nature, as I explained above. In a certain sense, it is unnatural for the spirit, which finds its activity hampered by the union, and therefore if the spirit cannot be freed in any other way, it must attain its natural perfection by the dissolution of the composite nature. We may state the case thus. Although human nature as such lacks the power to endure permanently as a whole and to adjust the opposites found in it, it is truly a nature and a good nature. But, while it exists in its totality, it has no more right to achieve a stable, permanent, and unified development than other purely animal natures. Only its superior spiritual part, which is endowed with power to live an indissoluble, unified life, can and must aspire to arrive at such a goal. In its vegetative and animal life, human nature is on a par with lower natures and has no stable and permanent end assigned to the individual. In its spiritual life, it is on a par with purely spiritual natures, and does have a permanent, enduring end destined for the individual. Since the lower and higher life are united in it, no reason is apparent why it should be either wholly immortal or wholly mortal. Its spiritual life follows the laws governing spirits, and its sense life follows the laws governing things of sense. Consequently, the opposition that endures throughout the union of both elements is resolved not by the victory of one of them over the other, but by their eventual separation. Thus we are confronted with a truly remarkable prodigy, but one that arises from the peculiar relations of this nature. The problem calls for a solution. The challenge has to be met. Yet reluctance to take it up is understandable. Although human nature is truly one nature, it cannot in totality achieve a unified development and reach a permanently enduring end, because elements so diametrically opposed as spirit and matter are combined in it. Power to compose the differences is lacking. Full development and attainment of the end are possible in only one of the elements, the higher. Accordingly, the seeming paradox must really be true. The unified development and enduring perfection of man's composite nature must be something supernatural. The material nature of the lower part and its tendency toward material multiplicity and dissolution cannot be modified or completely surmounted unless the lower part is raised above its nature so as to be conformed and subjected to the higher nature of the spirit that is united to it. It must in some way be spiritualized. In other words, the perfect and enduring unity of man's total nature is supernatural, because human nature virtually contains two natures whose opposition cannot be reconciled unless the lower one loses its own disposition and limitation and is made conformable to the higher one by being drawn up to its level. The higher nature has to pervade and rule the lower nature with a power it does not possess of itself, and can receive only from some superior nature. No wonder, then, that which in one respect seems to be the most natural thing in the world and in purely spiritual natures actually is natural in every respect, turns out to be supernatural in human nature. The unified and stable development of composite human nature, involving immortality and subordination of the flesh to the spirit, is natural if by that we mean a highly fitting and desirable perfection of nature. But it is not natural in the sense that it is necessary for nature and is required by nature. In the first place, the perpetual endurance of the whole nature is not natural, for nature has the power of immortality only in its spiritual component. It is certainly desirable for the spirit to preserve the body, especially if the spirit were not kept from its inner fulfillment by the body. But the spirit has no more right to permanent possession of the body than it has power to secure it. In the second place, freedom from the rebellion of sensuality and of the flesh against the spirit is natural to the extent that it effects a desirable unity among the various tendencies. Indeed, we may say that it is necessary to the extent that the spirit in its perfect state must be freed from this opposition by complete victory or by complete separation, if it is to enjoy peace, just as now it must constantly strive to rule and dominate the rebel. But such freedom is not natural in the sense that the conflict does not necessarily arise from the components of nature and may not exist during the time of nature's development and progress toward its end. The spiritual will is hampered in its striving by the flesh, but it is not destroyed, any more than reason is destroyed by the activity of sense and imagination. On the contrary, the will may be reinforced by sense appetite, just as reason may be assisted by phantasms. I remarked in passing that the spirit does not in all circumstances find it desirable to remain forever united with matter, for the reason that its own full development, particularly in interior and superior knowledge, is obstructed by the body. This is especially true when the spirit is left in its natural power and its purely natural relations with the body. Even then its activity is spiritual, although it is chiefly and directly concerned with material things, as the spirit is in some measure bound to matter. To develop its own activity freely and vigorously and thus attain its end, it must be equipped with a spiritual power of a higher order that will enable it to preserve its independence of the matter united with it, and to raise this matter to its own level without in any way being pulled down in the process. Or else, if it is to have nothing but its natural power, it must be completely separated from matter before it can reach the state of full perfection. Therefore, if we consider man's lower component, we find it not unnatural, and if we consider his higher component, we find it even natural that the higher part of nature, the spirit, on which personality and all man's special powers and prerogatives depend, should be able by itself to reach, and hence to require, an unruffled immortal life. But the same cannot be said of human nature regarded as a whole. If it is left with nothing but its own powers, which is undoubtedly possible, such a life is beyond its grasp. This investigation of man's complete nature shows that if the composing and constituting principles of nature are left to their own resources, nature in its totality is not capable of a uniform and enduring, that is, immortal perfection. Not even the higher part, which is naturally capable of such perfection, can reach that goal as long as it remains a component element of the complete nature. The footnote. Here we have an opportunity of describing and justifying in greater detail a point of dogma that is firmly settled, namely, that the immortality of the body and the unimpeded efficiency of the soul's faculties, or more exactly, the complete subjection of sense appetite to the guidance of reason, are supernatural. Such perfections do not arise from the principles of nature. In fact, as is clear from the principle established above, they need not even be conferred on nature by a higher nature and power. Nature is capable of existing in the integrity and perfection that are absolutely necessary for it without them. But these truths are secondary in this work. Besides, they have often been treated. They can be reconsidered here only so far as they are needed for grasping our main thesis and for rounding out our exposition when it comes into contact with them. The chief object of our investigation is nature and supernature in man with respect to his spiritual life, insofar as man himself is of spiritual nature. For it is only by the elevation of the spirit, the highest and most excellent part of nature, that man advances beyond his nature and is brought closer to a nature above him. In this way alone, a new sphere of life and activity that really belong to another higher nature opens up for him. A supernatural relation between spirit and matter in man is possible only if the lower part is made more conformable and subject to the higher part than it would be if left to itself. By this means, man can reach a position of eminence that is proper to a higher nature, for example, that of the angels, and in this respect his state can and must be called supernatural. But such a state is not supernature. In the first place, no new, higher system of life is established by it. Secondly, man's nature is not raised above its highest component. Yet the relation mentioned above does to some extent raise the lower part of nature to the level of the higher part, and although it does not flow from the principles of nature, it enters into the domain of those principles, since it intervenes between the two extremes that compose nature. This is the reason why many scholastic theologians number the gifts of integrity and immortality among goods included in the order of nature as constituting an integrity of nature, in opposition to a certain disorganization and infirmity that are inherent in nature. They contrast a natural original justice or rectitude with the gratuitous original justice that is the effect of supernatural grace. Thirdly, these gifts merely accompany and follow the state we have called supernature in the strict sense. When the spirit arrives at the higher state of supernature, and thus comes closer to God, source of all spiritual power, it is filled with a vital energy that enables it to pervade the entire nature belonging to it, to make this nature conformable and similar to itself, and in a certain way to spiritualize it. If we focus our gaze on what is properly supernature, that is, the elevation of the spirit to a share in the divine nature, we can spare no more than a passing glance for the supernatural in man's composite nature.